Hello, everybody. So today I'm going to be using The Last of the Mohicans to introduce two big concepts. The first is dark romanticism. Most of what we've been reading and watching so far explores the positive potential both of nature itself and also of human beings. But there is another side to romanticism that is more interested both in the negative potential of human nature and in the more sinister or dangerous aspects of the natural world. So this discussion is going to set us up nicely, not only for this unit, but for the next unit, which is looking at the Gothic tradition. The second concept that I want to look at here is the nostalgic tradition of Romanticism. We see this in artistic works that look back to some part of history that the creator sees as particularly glorious or beautiful. So, historical romance was a very popular literary genre in the 19th century, and James Fenimore Cooper is probably the best American exemplar of that tradition, which would also include British authors like Sir Walter Scott or French authors like Alexandre Dumas or Victor Hugo. More particularly, the literary and cinematic genre that I think best exemplifies this nostalgic romanticism in the United States is the Western. And Cooper is often looked to as the originator of that genre. So, this is why we are going to talk about him. All right, so beginning with dark romanticism, Emersonian transcendentalism, if you recall from about a month ago, is a pretty optimistic philosophy, given that it requires you to trust in the innate human capacity for knowing both oneself and the truth. If you're going to say that human beings can discover truth through their own insight, then you have to have a lot of optimism, a lot of trust in the ability of people to do that. So, over the past several weeks, we've been spending our time with people who engage in that quest for self knowledge and for enlightenment. And in our most recent cases, the environment in which they do that is nature. Only by shedding the corrupting influences of modern civilization and knowing the natural world in a pure, authentic, and unmediated way can the hero find what he is seeking. That is essentially kind of the overarching theme of the works that we've been reading for the past few weeks. Moving into dark romanticism is basically the opposite of all of that. It is transcendental romanticism's evil twin. So rather than exploring the positive human potential for self knowledge and spiritual perfection, dark romanticism is obsessed with the irrational, instinctual, and violent sides of human nature. So, insight that leads not to better self knowledge and better spiritual enlightenment, but that leads us to indulge in our most instinctual nature, that leads us to indulge kind of the dark side of ourselves. So, dark romanticism also tends to represent nature itself as a more hostile force against which human beings must contend. So, nature is also often used to reflect those dark aspects of human characters. Okay, so a good example of how the dark romantic tradition departs from the classical tradition is if we look at two different adaptations of the story of Don Juan from each period. So, in the paradigmatic classical composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, the principal character, who is always this prolific seducer of women, is punished for his sins in the final scenes by literally being dragged down to hell by a statue that's inhabited by the ghost of a man he murdered. Okay, so in the classical version of the Don Juan story, the seducer is punished. He's punished for his sins, and we are meant to rejoice that order has been restored and that evil has not triumphed. Decades later, Lord Byron, the English poet, in his epic poem Don Juan, would transform this protagonist into a kind of anti hero who serves to illuminate the hypocrisy and corruption of European society. So he becomes a more ambiguous figure, one in which the corruption of society is reflected, not somebody who society needs to do away with in order to move forward into a better future. Okay, we also see these same sort of differences in, say, Marlowe's version of Faust and Goethe's version of Faust. But if you understand what I'm talking about, then great. Or I'll let you investigate that on your own if you don't quite know what I'm talking about. So, dark romanticism is often conflated with Gothicism. But Gothicism nearly always involves some elements of the fantastical or the supernatural. And James Fenimore Cooper's work is a pretty good example of how we can have dark romanticism without it becoming Gothic, without it shading over into the supernatural, fantastical stuff. And we see this in the very first chapter of The Last of the Mohicans, in which Cooper uses his description of the natural setting of the novel to reflect the violence of the conflict between the English and the French. So the very first line is as you see here. The novel begins, it is a feature peculiar to the colonial wars of North America that the toils and dangers of the wilderness were to be encountered before the adverse hosts could meet. And as the chapter proceeds, this theme is developed further. He says, perhaps no district throughout the wide extent of the intermediate frontiers can furnish a livelier picture of the cruelty and fierceness of the savage warfare of those periods than the country which lies between the headwaters of the Hudson and the adjacent lakes. So nature here doesn't facilitate spiritual progress. It's not an environment conducive to better self-understanding and enlightenment. Rather, this environment facilitates violence. It's not a space of tranquility where we realize the truth of existence. It's a space of struggle and of bloodshed. It's not an escape from the corrupting influence of civilization. And importantly, it's also not portrayed as being violated by this human conflict. Rather, Cooper shows us a natural setting that is itself hostile and that reflects and even actively participates in this conflict. He says, though the arts of peace were unknown to this fatal region, its forests were alive with men, its shades and glens rang with the sounds of martial music, and the echoes of its mountains threw back the laugh or repeated the wanton cry of many a gallant and reckless youth as he hurried by them in the noontide of his spirits to slumber in a long night of forgetfulness. The alarmed colonists believed that the yells of the savages mingled with every fitful gust of wind that issued from the interminable forests of the West. So, likewise, Cooper's emphasis here, just as it's not on the beauty of nature, but rather the hostility of nature, his emphasis in describing the human conflict is not on the glory or heroism of war, but rather the ways in which war reveals human fallibility or human limitation. So, speaking about the English side of the conflict, Cooper says the imbecility, meaning the stupidity of her military leaders abroad, and the fatal want of energy in her councils at home had lowered the character of Great Britain from the proud elevation on which it had been placed by the talents and enterprise of her former warriors and statesmen. So Britain has been corrupted, it has been reduced by its ineffectual leadership. Of the civilians in this conflict, he also says that the magnifying influence of fear began to set at naught the calculations of reason and to render those who should have remembered their manhood the slaves of the basest passions. So, again, we're exploring the base, the instinctual, the dark side of human nature here. So in keeping that with that obsession with the negative side of human nature, dark romanticism tends to feature somewhat ambiguous heroes and villains. We tend to have heroes who don't quite fit in with mainstream society and villains who we can't help but admire. So in this case, Hawkeye is a character who stands between cultures. He's a white scout who travels with and speaks the language of his native companions, and he even prefers, in some ways, the native culture to his own. In a passage from chapter 3, he tells Chingachgook, I'm willing to own that my people have many ways of which, as an honest man, I cannot approve. He also has something of a dark side to him. We see that he harbors very deep prejudices against the Iroquois tribe, largely because of his loyalty to the Mohicans, and he even considers shooting Magua before he is revealed to be a villain. And in upcoming chapters, you do see that he is quite a violent man. This is not a peaceful person. This is not the kind of bodhisattva that we would see in the Dharma bums. He's a violent guy, by necessity, but also perhaps a little bit because it is part of his nature. So Magua, who is the villain of Last of the Mohicans, is also a romantic type. He's the villain who may actually be the most charismatic and interesting character in the book. Now, granted, we're not reading the whole thing. And so, since most of the evidence for this charisma comes from chapters we won't be reading, you may just kind of have to take my word for it if you don't remember or if you haven't read the entire thing. His French name, Le Renard Subtil, the subtle fox, kind of gives you the sense that Magua is this highly intelligent and calculating person. The first description we get of him says that there was a sullen fierceness mingled with the quiet of the savage. So he's this dangerous person, but there's a coolness about him. He isn't rash or indiscriminate in his cruelty or violence. He pursues his purpose, which we find out about a little bit later, with an intelligence and a single mindedness. And in true romantic fashion, we admire his cunning and ability, despite the fact that he is fighting for quote unquote the wrong side. Okay. Literary critic David Kesterton, in fact, looks at Magua and many of Cooper's other demonic chieftains through the lens of the character of Satan from John Milton's Paradise Lost. This was an epic, Paradise Lost was an epic poem written by the English poet John Milton that tells us the story of Satan's rebellion against God, his expulsion from heaven, and then his efforts to convince Adam and Eve to similarly rebel against God's commands, bringing about the fall of man. Written in the 17th century, in other words, the classical period, this poem was meant, in Milton's own words, to justify the ways of God to man, to explain why God allowed evil into the world. However, Satan, as Milton writes him, is so charismatic and compelling that fans of Milton's work in the Romantic period came to see him as the real protagonist or even the real hero of the story. And that's just the essence of Berlin's definition of Romanticism. You admire someone even though he is literally the devil. So now, Cooper's daughter, James Fenimore Cooper's daughter, later said that her father could seldom be induced to read more than a page or two of Milton at a time, the great epic poet he considered too correctly cold and classical in spirit for his theme. Nevertheless, Kesterton argues that the influence of Milton on the portrayal of Magua is almost certain. Magua is given the same physical characteristics as Milton's Satan, and he's referred to using the epithet Prince of Darkness. They're both very captivating and persuasive speakers, and they are both motivated by a desire for revenge. And in fact, it's a desire that we, the audience, could even sympathize with. Magua is trying to avenge himself on the father of Cora and Alice, who has done something quite terrible, in fact, to Magua's people. So his cause is in many ways sympathetic, even if we really don't want him to hurt the people that we come to sympathize with in this story. Okay. So let's move on from there to the second major subject for today, which has to do with romantic nostalgia. So, Romanticism, both the dark and the happy version, tended to have a preoccupation with earlier eras. And a lot of the truly popular literature of this period, meaning the literature that lots and lots of people actually read. Okay, there weren't a whole lot of people reading Walt Whitman in the middle of the 19th century. There weren't a whole lot of people reading Walden in the middle of the 19th century. People were reading Sir Walter Scott, then they were reading James Fenimore Cooper. Okay, they were reading historical romance. So in Britain, this historical romance again took kind of the form of medieval romance. So you had Ivanhoe and the other novels by Sir Walter Scott, and especially Arthurian romance. Lord Tennyson kind of reinvigorated interest in the myths of King Arthur through his poetry. In the United States, however, there is no medieval past to draw upon, or at least not one that includes Europeans. So this urge to mythologize is directed at the idea of the frontier. And thus, we might say that the uniquely American contribution to this nostalgic tradition was the Western. And James Fenimore Cooper is generally credited as the inventor of the Western genre. So this might not make total sense at first, because we typically associate Westerns with stories that happen in like Texas or Wyoming and not upstate New York, which is where Last of the Mohicans is set. But in 1757, which is when the story happens, Western New York really was the frontier. As you can see from this map, you'll note that the line in between the dark green and the light green, that is the frontier. And in the dead middle of the map, with kind of surrounded by blue fire, we see Fort William Henry, right there on the line. between the British holdings and the disputed territory. The Last of the Mohicans, however, was published in 1826, which was more than half a century after that war. And at this point, the map looked like this. Okay, there had been a bunch of new states added. Everything in dark orange was part of the United States at that point, was a U.S. state, and everything west of that was sort of unincorporated territory, was Indian country for the most part, or was claimed by Spain. Okay, so a bunch of new states had been added. The frontier had shifted further west. And so in 1826, Cooper was looking back to a period in time before there was any such thing as the United States, and when pure wilderness could be found in his own home state of New York, rather than hundreds or even thousands of miles away. And this trend would continue. Not all, but certainly most of the great Western novels that you're familiar with about Texas and Utah and Wyoming, novels of Louis L'Amour, Larry McMurtry, Zane Grey, etc., were written in the early 20th century. And they're looking back to a time when before the political boundaries of the United States had reached the Pacific Ocean. And the great Western films were made in the 1940s and the 1950s and beyond. Again, more than a half century after the American frontier was declared closed in 1890. So the Western genre is almost inherently retrospective. It's not about encouraging the reader to go out and seek adventure on the frontier. Rather, it induces a longing in the reader for a kind of adventure that just isn't available anymore. It's mythical. It completely belongs to the past. We can't go back there. And among the things that we are persuaded to yearn for are the Indians themselves. Excuse me, I skipped this map accidentally. So we're meant to long for the Indians themselves as part of this kind of lost way of life. And they're given to us in Cooper's novels and in a lot of Westerns as these sort of mythical beings. I mean, almost in the same way of like J.R.R. Tolkien's elves or hobbits. They're presented to us as if they belong to this mythical past and are not people who live and breathe in the present. Indeed, we're told in the very title that the Mohicans are essentially extinct, that these are the last of them. Chingachgook tells us as much in chapter 3. He says, I am on the hilltop and must go down into the valley, meaning he's going to die. And when Uncas follows in my footsteps, there will no longer be any of the blood of the Sagamores, for my boy is the last of the Mohicans. Okay? The thing is that this isn't really true. Mohicans still existed in 1826. It's just that they had moved to Massachusetts, and many of them had converted to Christianity. Today, in 2021, Mohicans still exist. It's just that they live in Wisconsin, and some of them live in Canada. So originally, the Mohican tribe was part of a confederation of tribes called the Algonquins, and they inhabited this Adirondack region, this mountainous region of what is now New York State. Here on the map, you're looking at upstate New York, on the boundaries between New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. This was Mohican territory originally. Okay, they really did have a history of conflict with the Mohawk, who were part of the Iroquois Confederation or Iroquois Nation. And this conflict only intensified with the arrival of European colonists as tribes began to compete with each other to sell furs, as part of the fur trade with the Dutch. During conflicts between Britain and France in this region, these tribes really did take sides. And the Mohicans fought with the British, and the Mohawks fought alongside the French. So Mohawks actually took control of the former Mohican territory well before the action of this book, sometime in the early 1600s. And as a result of this, the tribe migrated to what would become Western Massachusetts and Connecticut. So when Chingachgook says that he and his son are the last of the Mohicans, he means that they're the last of the Mohicans in the Adirondacks, not the last of the Mohicans in the world. In Massachusetts, the Mohicans became known as the Stockbridge Indians because they settled near the town of Stockbridge. And they tended to be friendly with the settlers there. Many converted to Christianity, and they had good relations with the Moravian missionaries who lived there. Some even fought alongside the colonists during the Revolutionary War. However, the history of contact between Native Americans and European settlers is, as you know, positively filled with atrocity and outrage. From the beginning of contact, the native populations in the Western Hemisphere experienced catastrophic declines. And this was thanks not only to the direct activities of the Europeans themselves in attacking or removing the Indians, but to the introduction of diseases like smallpox, against which the native populations had no immunity. So, from a population of nearly a million in what is now the United States, the numbers of Native Americans were cut nearly in half by 1800, and by the turn of the 20th century, there would be roughly 300,000 left. Okay, so that is awful. That is catastrophic. But we should still note that there were 300,000. And yet, in spite of that, there was an entire literary genre making it seem like the American Indians and their way of life were completely a thing of the past. And what's more, these novels made it seem almost inevitable, that it was just bound to happen and that it was kind of nobody's fault. And it was this sense of inevitability that made it seem like it was simply the destiny of American settlers to come in and claim this land as their own. But in fact, of course, none of this was inevitable. Throughout the 19th century, these tribes suffered as a result of very explicit government policies. In 1830, so just 4 years after the publication of The Last of the Mohicans, the Indian Removal Act resulted in the expulsion of native tribes from the eastern part of the United States. The Mohicans, or the Stockbridge Indians as they were commonly known, were relocated to a reservation in Shawanoe County, Wisconsin, where 22,000 of them continue to live today. So I don't think we can really say that like Cooper's writing caused that to happen, that it was the sole inspiration for the Indian Removal Act of 1830. But The Last of the Mohicans, which was a bestseller, did help contribute to this idea that Native Americans, however lovely and dignified and wonderful they might have been, were simply not fit for the modern world, and that in some Darwinian sense, they weren't supposed to survive. And that is all in spite of the fact that this novel, for 1826, actually is quite racially progressive. The native characters in this novel are intelligent, charismatic, noble. Their way of life is treated with respect by Cooper. There is even some implication that Cora may have some African ancestry, as her mother is different from Alice's mother. And there's some implied romance even between Cora and Uncas. It's just that the dignity Cooper gives these characters and their potential racial mixing is kind of a tragic dignity. It's the kind that you give to characters who aren't going to survive in order to procreate. So, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at some examples of Western films. And in case you haven't noticed the pattern yet, one of them, The Searchers, is going to come from the late 1950s, and the other, Dances with Wolves, from the 1990s. So, since Monday is a holiday, I'm not going to do a full lecture of The Searchers on The Searchers. So, let me just give you a very brief introduction today. So The Searchers, which is directed by John Ford, incidentally, one of Stalin's favorite filmmakers. In fact, it is even thought that he was, or reported actually by eyewitnesses, that he was watching a John Ford film, not The Searchers, because he died in 1953 and this was 1956. But Stalin was watching a John Ford film the night that he died. So The Searchers is considered to be one of the greatest Western films in history, probably the greatest Western film in history. It was named the greatest American Western by the American Film Institute in 2008, and it is also frequently listed as one of the best American films ever made. It features tropes that you should absolutely recognize from The Last of the Mohicans. There is an Indian captivity storyline in which a young white girl who is played by Natalie Wood is taken by the Comanches of Texas. It features an ambiguous hero who is played by John Wayne. He wears a black hat despite being the hero, which is very important in Western iconography. Usually the heroes wear white hats and the villains wear black hats. But John Wayne is our hero and he wears a black hat. He also, like Hawkeye, knows a lot about Native Americans, and he also happens to be quite racist, and that's kind of a major point of the film. There's also a very charismatic Comanche villain who is played by Henry Brandon, who is a Caucasian actor, a white actor, and not a Native American actor. We will talk about that a little bit. And finally, it is all shot against the beautiful but quite inhospitable landscape of West Texas. So for 1956, this film also had some somewhat racially progressive ideas. One of the good guys is racially mixed, and the moral arc of the film is essentially about whether John Wayne will be able to overcome his racism in order to save his niece. But for reasons that we will discuss, it also does not really hold up that well in light of the cultural politics of today. So there's some things in there that are going to make you cringe a little bit. The film that we will watch the following week, Dances with Wolves, is an example of a more modern film that really tries to get the portrayal of Native Americans right and not to whitewash like the whole actual history of contact between the native tribes and the role of the settlers and the US government in what happened to them. We can talk about whether or not it succeeds when we get there. In this week's discussion thread, though, I invite you to see if you can find any other tropes of dark romanticism or of the Western in what we have read in The Last of the Mohicans so far. And because this book is very well known in Russia, I would love to know more about your prior exposure to it, what you've heard about it, or what you associate with it. Okay, so I look forward to reading your thoughts.